So what's going on, guys? DIY Dan here again, and in this video I'm going to be building a set of steps for the front of my sister's house. Now obviously they still need a coat of paint. I basically left that up to her with what she wants to finish it off with. This video is going to go over the construction of the deck and steps and handrail that I built, along with some mistakes I made, so hopefully you don't make those same mistakes. Another thing to keep in mind when watching this video is that I did not buy any material except for a 4x8 sheet of shiplap paneling that I used for the very top of the actual deck, basically as an easily replaceable wear item. The rest of the material used for these steps was either leftover from her or I having it from previous projects. However, this video goes over a basic concept of how to put one of these things together so you can modify size and materials as you see fit for your application. So let's get to it. So my sister's house is about 18 inches above ground level. So what I started out by doing is basically making a box for the main deck platform. So she had a bunch of leftover 2x2 material and some little pieces of 2x6. So I decided to use the 2x2s for the top and bottom rails and then made the supports out of the 2x6 smaller pieces that she had. I used screws to attach all these, pre-drilled them with a countersink, and ran them in. Now, kind of a weird thing to these steps is I actually had this old door that was 8 feet tall and about 3 feet wide that I was going to use for the top deck. I got this door from a buddy of mine and it had a couple splits in the wood, so it wasn't good enough to do as an actual door, so he thought I could repurpose it for something else. So obviously you're probably not going to have a 3 foot by 8 foot solid wood door laying around. So you could also use some 2x4s, 2x6s, etc. Or at a minimum, a 3/4 inch piece of plywood would work good for the top deck. After building the front and back rails, I went ahead and put them on top of each other, then measured the remaining amount of door that was left so I could build the side rails. I used a total of 5 supports for the front and back rails because they were 8 feet long. For the side rails, I used a total of 3. Now, because I was using that door for the top deck, I only needed a total of 3 supports under the center. If you were using a piece of 3/4 inch plywood instead, I would recommend doing one more center support. Once again, I used screws to hold all these pieces together, and I countersunk the screws and used about a 3-inch drywall screw in order to hold them together. Once that was all done, I went ahead and put the door on top for the deck. I did not secure it at this time because I built this at my house and we were taking it over to her house to put it together. Then it was time to figure out what we were going to do for the steps. Now, because this was an 18-inch tall deck, I wanted a total of 3 steps, the deck being the top step. So we figured a 6-inch spacing. Now, once again, since I was using the material we had, I made these steps out of 2x4s and I used some miscellaneous 2x6s that we had for the supports underneath the steps. I cut the supports at 4.5 inches plus the 1.5 inches of the 2x4 gave me a total height of 6 inches. So right here I am cutting those supports for underneath the steps, and you'll notice that I'm actually should be using a table saw here, but I didn't feel like pulling my table saw out because I was kind of limited for room in my garage. So I went ahead and slit that inch off of the 2x6 using my miter saw. So this is obviously not the safest way to cut this material, so make sure you do use a table saw in order to do this. So I was going to use a total of 3 2x4s side by side for each one of the bottom steps. So I cut that bottom 2x6 support, the total length of 6 2x4s sitting side by side. Then we went ahead and anchored the first 3 2x4s to that bottom support. I secured the 2x4s to the outside 2x6 with 2 screws in each one. Then I built 2 more supports. We measured those out equally underneath the steps and anchored those with 1 screw in each 2x4. I had some leftover pieces of 2x8 or maybe 2x12 that I cut the same distance with what was left from the back of the 2x4s to the end of the 2x6 and anchored those with some screws, and that was my bracket to hold the next step in place. Now, I did use a handful of screws to secure these blocks because that's what was going to hold the next step in place. The support for the second step I had to cut out of a 2x8 because a 2x6 was going to be too short because I had the extra layer from the 2x4s from the first step. So I needed to rip those supports right at 6 inches because the 2x4s are going to offset from the first step to the second step. Once ripping those, we went ahead and secured those with a minimum of 3 screws in each one. Once securing those, we went in and put the 3 2x4s on top of that step and secured those in the same manner that we did the first one. Now, because this was some used material, I did have to use a clamp to hold this wood in place while we tightened it because it was a little warped. Now, being as though we were using 3 2x4s for each step, these are a pretty good sized step. I was debating on putting some type of a kick plate so people's toes would not be getting caught under the steps to prevent a trip hazard. But my sister wanted the most visibility as she could underneath those steps, so we didn't put it on. Which is something you might consider if there is elderly people going up and down these stairs a lot. After we got the platform and the stairs built, it was time to add a grab handle to make it easier to go up and down these steps. Once again, I used some 2x6s in order to do this. I made 2 of them on the top deck and secured those to the bottom. I had one of my kids stand on the top deck and just put their hand down at a comfortable place for the grab handle and cut those to length. I used a piece of 2x2 and cut that to length all the way on the back 2x6 and then halfway on the front 2x6 and secured those. Then I secured one more 2x6 that was a little shorter down by the front step. I used a minimum of about 5 screws in each one of these because I wanted them to be very stout and secure. Once securing that bottom 2x6 to the step, I grabbed another piece of 2x2 and held it in place where it was going to be at a comfortable height as far as an angle down with the steps, and then took a pencil and marked out all my angles. I used a jigsaw to cut the angle on the 2x6s and used the miter saw to cut the angle on the 2x2. And that's about all I could do at my house. It was time to transport it over to my sister's house and put it in place. Now, one thing I will say is I actually should have made this about 2 inches shorter than what I did. Now, the reason I say that is I was setting this deck and stairs directly on top of dirt. So if I would have made that first step a little shallower and the whole thing, I could have set some pavers on the ground and set the stairs on the pavers, and that way it's not directly making contact with that dirt, in hopes that it makes it a little bit more difficult for termites and other bugs to make direct contact with those stairs. At this point, it doesn't really matter. We'll just have to see how long they last. Once we got our grade level, we went in and set that deck in place and added the stairs, got those level, and then secured the stairs to the deck with long screws going through those 2x6 supports into the steps. Once I got the steps secured to the actual deck itself, then I went ahead and put the grab handle in place and secured it to the uprights. I also set that 4x8 sheet of shiplap on top of the deck and secured the shiplap and the door to the deck with some 3-inch screws all the way around it. And that's about it for the construction side of things. All that's left to do is for her to figure out whether she's going to paint it or somehow protect it from the weather. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this video and it gave you some good information. If so, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. I'd really appreciate it. The whole concept of my channel is to give you guys the most information in the least amount of time as possible so I don't waste your time. And I hope to see you next time. Have a good one. Later.